All right, so we're going to talk about performance-based assessment in this video today. And when we think about performance-based assessment, the sort of generalized, stereotypical thing we think about are things that you have to see and watch and view. Like on the screen there, I have a recital or an opera picture. And while that's true, this does fall under the category of a performance-based assessment. The genre, as you will, is not limited to something performancy, like you're visually looking at something like that. It does not have to be defined that way. And as we talk about how these work and what sort of things count as performance-based assessment, I think you'll get a better idea of just how robust and authentic this category can be in the classroom. So I really like this image. It's really fun for me. If you're not familiar, IKEA is a really interesting, huge building where you can buy a lot of not pre-made, but furniture cheaply, but you have to be able to put it together yourself, and which can be an interesting experience to understand the very small directions that are picture-oriented that they give you and be able to put them together. This sort of picture is sort of a good idea of what an authentic assessment is. Can you work at IKEA, i.e. can you build all of their furniture? You have to make your seat for the job interview. That is actually an authentic assessment. I mean, it'd be a pretty awful thing to do to someone applying for a job, don't get me wrong. But insofar as your ability to actually do something, that would test it. You would have to master those skills and show me that you have legitimately learned how to do stuff like this in order to get a product on the spot. So that's one reason why we do like authentic assessments and performance-based assessments, is that I have a complete and utter understanding of your mastery of something because you're showing it to me right here, right now. Okay, so as you probably heard me just say, these are considered authentic assessments, and they are newer in the sense that, multiple choice and true false items have been around a long time. But performance-based assessments, the whole field as a genre, moved from the older historical sort of portfolio-based assessments and then went to this performance-based assessment. We're going to talk a little bit more about the history of this in a few later slides. But the idea here is that you're offering something that's real world. And we find in literature that relevance, giving a student utility value and helping them understand why something is important to be known, really helps their understanding and their motivation and mastery of the subject. So for example, I am not particularly motivated to learn algebra. No, not like the intrinsic joy of it doesn't really exist for me insofar as my completion of algebra homework. But if you can tell me and explain to me the whole process about why that's important, you have a much better chance of having me actually engage in algebra. In an authentic assessment, we would then have me be required to do algebraic homework for a distinct purpose. So you'd have to give me something real world, like some sort of monetary game, or have me do like simulated grocery shopping or something like that to make it a performance-based assessment. So I think you're getting a good idea of how these real-world activities can transfer into a classroom, and they can transfer into a classroom on multiple levels. It's not limited to a particular grade level or a particular subject area. You'll find the hard sciences and mathematics have an easier time of doing performance-based assessments, but be that as it may, they exist for English and they exist for history and for ELL learners. And I have some resources that I put online to help you sort of understand how that all sort of fits together. Okay, so in this class, at least in my section of the class, we did group teaching. And that was supposed to be a performance-based assessment in the sense that I am assessing you attempting to teach your peers, in which case that's about as authentic of an assessment as I can get. Okay, so you can see some other examples on the listed, and I don't want to read them to you, but in general, they are typical situations that one would find themselves in that you recreate in your classroom. All right, so we are generally, or almost always, directly measuring something when we do a performance-based assessment, of which PBA is performance-based assessment. We do abbreviate that frequently because it's kind of long. So we directly measure it. We don't look at indicators particularly because indicators are suggestive. They're not really a finite, measurable thing. And if you think about authentic assessments, these are action-based things. So I need some way to rate the performance. And for that to happen, I have to have some criteria. And it can't be something like pass, fail, particularly, because that's not defined well enough. Similarly, I'm not going to have like a 4-step process, particularly for an authentic assessment, because in authentic assessment, things are measured differently depending on the person. So that's not going to work either. Okay, so when we look at what we're assessing, then we're looking at really complex cognitive learning. And please remember when I say that just because we end up looking at something complex doesn't mean there were a whole lot of lower ability things built into the process. Sort of by definition, the complex tasks that we're looking at require that you, if we're using Bloom, you went through understanding and remembering and applying, and you went to creating. So don't think that just because you hit creating, it doesn't mean that you're not handling the rest of the taxonomy. So we can also look at attitudes. And attitudes were something that we really couldn't address previously, but I can totally take a look at someone's attitude when they're doing a debate. Are they interested and engaged, and are they giving me lip or service, or I don't know what you might see, but you could always address it in an actual performance assessment. And something that's really interesting to note is social skills. Now, I can't, for the life of me, think of any sort of higher order multiple choice question that I could actually get at social skills with. Social skills generally need interaction to be adequately measured. And so in a performance assessment where you could be doing it individually or with groups, then social skills are a very easy thing to measure. Okay, so what we look at, on the other hand, are achievements and habits of mind and just real world authentic things that we like, because teamwork and public speaking are very important, not just in the classroom, but they carry over into the wider world and past the classroom. So these are things that we don't really have a good way of measuring. Like, it's really hard to measure teamwork unless someone is doing some sort of group activity, which is generally a performance assessment. Okay, so when we look at performance assessment in the lesson, we start looking at immediate feedback. So depending on how you set up your performance assessment, you should be able to give students immediate feedback because you're scoring it right then and there. Because if you don't, then you missed it and you have nothing to score. It's kind of the sort of additional element to that. So if you are, watching group activities, unless you're taping your class, you have to mark it right then and there, or else you are out of luck, because trying to remember all the interactions of every student in groups while multiple groups are occurring, that's difficult. And don't try and set yourself up for situations like that, because they are very hard to measure adequately and fairly. Okay. Also, we reinforce learning. So if a student is showing me a lab protocol and they do something out of order, I can correct it right then and there. So it's something insofar as immediate feedback that students are able to demonstrate what they think is supposed to happen, and I can correct it immediately. And I have some examples for you on the right side of the screen about sort of embedded in lessons that you can put in performance-based assessment. So I guess it needs to be said, because I've had the misconception come up in class before. When you do a performance-based assessment, it can be a huge summative project, for sure. I'm sure you can think of some that are humongous projects. But they don't have to be. They can be really small. They can just be a very minor portion of your lesson. And I think that sometimes is not what we generally think of. So this idea of programming on calculators, I remember doing this. I didn't particularly realize that it was performance assessment at the time, but that's not like the complete and utter, that's not all the time I spent on the class was programming on calculators. That was maybe 10 minutes or something that we were doing that. It wasn't a very lengthy process. Okay. So we look at the social skills aspect of this. We have these sort of complex tasks that we're able to really take a look at. So this idea that you can take in information and then spit it out in a different way is really interesting. And of course I can look at that in an essay, but it's very interesting and it's preferred by the class generally to share this information out loud in a performance assessment. So I'm not going to be reading all of that to you, but I do want to point out that if you're familiar with this whole dispositions thing that the College of Education is requiring some of the pre-service teachers to complete, we address social skills through defined rubrics of like communication, working with others, takes guidance well. Let's see, what other social skills? I'm trying to recall off the top of my head, and that's probably a bad practice. So try not to do that yourself, but I'm thinking one of them that really sticks out to me is email. So there's verbal communication as a category, and then there's written communication. And generally the phrasing is candidate expresses themselves well with others or to others or something like that. So the phrasing's a little strange, but these are ways that we actually attempt to address your social skills. So can you communicate well with others? Can you work in a group successfully, or does the group combust? That's the sort of thing you might be able to take a look at and assess. And it doesn't have to be the focus of the assessment by any means, but it can be very important for you to address when you have students in groups. So this is, yet another thing in your toolkit, rather. It's not meant to replace a traditional test. You will find that parents and some principals are a little wary of performance-based assessments because, as mentioned earlier, they are newer. So they are not as, well known, and you might find that parents of foreign students might not be aware of this as an actual assessment thing. They might not think of it as a normal way to assess their student or their child, I'm sorry. But they are legitimately an authentic assessment, and I wouldn't say that you should take every assessment in your class and make it a performance assessment. There are teachers that have done that, and they can do it successfully, but it takes a lot of practice and a lot of time to reformat everything to be a performance assessment. And truly, not everything needs to be a performance assessment. All right, so we start thinking then about how in the world do I actually do this in my classroom, and we've got a couple steps involved. When we think about implementing performance-based assessment in the classroom, we need to consider a few things. So part one, what do you test? So this should be pretty obvious and pretty normal. The first place to start in any test is, well, what are you testing? What is integral and the most important elements that you need to cover in this test? So if you remember back, test blueprints were really helpful for us because we knew what the objectives were. So we knew what exactly it is we needed to cover. And then we started laying out by Bloom's taxonomy level what sort of items should be devoted to that objective and to what level. And that's the same sort of thing that you're going to want to do here too, except instead of the sort of divvying up of items, it's just going to be a performance assessment. But that doesn't mean that the level and objective aren't important anymore. So again, you decide what you want to test. You start thinking about what your learning process entails and what can you actually build the performance assessment around. Sometimes you are quite limited by the curriculum. Some things are just harder to make of performance assessments than others. And you'll find that. And so as I think of that, it reminds me that the performance-based assessment project for this class, you won't find that the CPALMS benchmarks that you pulled from, not all of them fit well as a performance assessment, just flat out. They don't lend themselves to being performance assessments. And some of them do. Some of them are so performance oriented that it's just unreal, and that, of course, what else would you do but a performance assessment? But the idea here is to, at least for that project, is to find a good benchmark that lends itself to being a performance assessment. All right, so let's keep going. When we actually go about looking and designing this, we have to create some sort of situation or simulation of knowledge and skills and attitudes together. So you have to remember that at the ultimate end of this, you're going to be seeing something. And you want to try and make it as realistic as possible. So in lower grades, you might say that you would give them a whole scenario situation where you're a checkout clerk at a grocery store, and then you have customers coming through, so the students coming through with their various produce and whatever you have from your centers that you can have the student check out, and they have to do their math skills that way. That is an authentic assessment. You've situationally created something that legitimately exists. They could go to a checkout store, and like a grocery store, and they would see someone with a conveyor belt and scanning the merchandise and having to make change. That is a legitimate, authentic assessment. And that is something that people who work at Publix would face all the time, right? All right, so in this class, I don't think this applies to everyone who's happening to listen to this recording, but insofar as the measuring dispositions, I'm measuring dispositions by the way you communicate. I don't really have a choice because we're online this semester, but I look at the way you communicate with me, the sort of respect and the care in the writing that you take, your promptness, whether you're late to post or you're early to post, These are all things that influence my decision about your dispositions. And I think that that's a very interesting way for me to observe your performance in the class. And that's something that you might not particularly be aware that your teacher on the other side of things is actually aware of these things. All right, so step 3, and this is a very important step. How in the world do I grade this sucker? Because they can be super quick. If I do a lab experiment, especially in chemistry, and the experiment is, it's a very quick one where you have 5 seconds or something before the experiment's over, I have to have a really good scoring plan so I know that the students did whatever I'm evaluating very quickly. I need to be able to mark it very quickly, move on to the next student, because if it's only a 5-second thing, then I don't have much time to watch this and take explicit notes. And so we're going to go through the different ways that you might evaluate, such as checklists, rating scales, rubrics, records, and portfolios. Portfolios are going to have their own separate content because they're kind of a big deal. But you really need to take this into consideration when you're designing an activity in your class, because you need to be able to grade students fairly. That's a no-brainer. Every student should receive the same evaluation. Well, how do you do that in really quick timing categories? Okay, so when we look at the criteria, we start with clear criteria. So you can't give away the task, you can't give away the answer when explaining the task, which is easier said than done sometimes. It's surprising how when you're attempting to help students that you can really just take over and not really help them learn. Yeah, it's just surprising how that can be. You can be frustrated with their not comprehending or understanding of what you're saying and do it for them, and that doesn't help them any. So you have to be very clear how to almost give yourself a script on how you can help, and sometimes you just let it be that they didn't get it, which is it sounds horrible, and I would say that you would always want to follow up with it. But at the time that you're evaluating, sometimes they just don't get it, and that's it. That's all you can say. Not every moment is a teachable moment, but that's definitely a decision call for you to make in your classroom, whether it's appropriate or not to mark them as wrong, and just how much coaching and help you'll give them before you just say, no, they did not understand this. And we'll just give you free license right now to say that yes, you can mark students as not having understood something. When we have benchmarks where you say, did the student understand this, yes or no? If it's no, then they need the remedial help, and that's perfectly legitimate. It's an unfortunate thing that they might get a very low score on this assessment, but then it's also a trigger to you, the student, and the student's parents that more help is needed in this mastery of skill set. Okay, yeah. Moving on. All right, so we want something that is difficult enough, right? I either want to be testing on something that they completely understand, they know backwards and forwards, and I'm making them do this assessment, which is sort of like in that applying category, taking them slightly out of the comfort zone and shifting it. Or I want them to do something sort of zone of proximal development wise, where they have most of the skills that they need to complete the activity, and they have to be making connections that are just reaching a little bit above to complete it. So that's going to depend on what your you're thinking about. So when I think about this, I'm saying that you want something complex enough, like understanding of the themes of a Shakespearean play. And now I want you to go do it in rap in present day. So how do I translate that story to present day and convert it to something like rap? So that is a complex task, but you might understand, you might have talked about in class the themes involved in Shakespeare that you could potentially convey that in another story. So translate it both to present day and make it a rap based assessment, or a musical assessment, I guess. The otherwise, sort of what you might be thinking about so far, that zone of proximal development I was talking about, is so scaffolding, like a lab project where you have students, they have the instructions on how chemicals react. So they might have been talking about how chemicals react and how bases and solvents and stuff work. And now you're having them apply that knowledge, and maybe they don't know exactly the sort of reaction they're going to be expecting, or they could sort of theorize what the reaction will be, and then they do it. So that's sort of what I was talking about, something that's sort of within reach, but not that they know the exact answer to it. Okay. When we talk about sort of this triangulation of assessments, what the ideal here is that you have more than one way to measure the learning. Or like, okay, so if you have an objective, if you'll remember back to test blueprints, we have an objective, and you might have had multiple levels of items that you were covering it with. That is the idea here with this triangulation of assessment. So the same thing applies in performance-based assessment. You want to have maybe a checklist. You maybe want a student writing sample, and you want maybe the students to grade themselves, peer assessment. So multiple assessments of the actual performance. Okay. More often than not, performance assessments will have multiple solutions, even in something as so mundane as the grocery store example I was talking about earlier. There's no saying what combination a student might bring to the cash register. So there are always going to be multiple solutions. And I think that that's pretty much impossible for anything not to have multiple solutions. The only exceptions I'm sort of thinking about are the sort of orchestra band exceptions, where every student might be playing a different instrument, or you might have an entire section playing the same part of a song, and so there might not really be a multiple solution situation there. But generally, you wouldn't, in most of the other, English, math, science, history sort of stuff, there's always going to be the ability to have multiple solutions. And even in band, there's the ability, you could have students doing multiple different pieces of showcasing skills. Like the same song doesn't have to be used to showcase the same skill set. You can have the same skill set be shown and assessed with many different songs. You don't have to use the same one. Okay. When you look at the sort of revising and refining of task stuff, when you're creating the assessment itself, you want to think about the demands on the student for self-regulated learning. How much are they going to need to do that? Because that is something that maybe you should give them points for, because self-regulated learning is not the easiest thing to do, depending on your age and the supports you've had throughout your educational experience. Not all students have a clue on how to do this, and especially if you're looking at, kindergarten through third, self-regulated learning is getting there, but it's maybe not so great. um, so definitely something to consider when you're actually looking at these tasks. Okay, so back to step 3. I feel like we went 2 steps forward and 1 step back. The scoring rubrics in general, you need to really limit it to the easiest to rate, rather than the most important required. And that seems counterintuitive, but as you know, I've sort of stressed this earlier, you generally don't have enough time to measure everything, even the most important pieces. You can sort of think of criteria that are, checkmark boxes. Did they do this? Yes. What or at what level? Well, you can make that into a checklist, and that's a very easy way to do it. Or you could have really small notes, like when we do group teaching in the classroom, I have a field for the length of time of the assignment. The rubric looks different when you're doing a performance in class, because I rate per person and also have to keep track of the time per group. So I'll just have a timestamp in that field, but but insofar as did every group member speak, that's a checkmark box for me. Yes, they did. One person spoke more than the other is also a checkmark that I have when I'm doing these assessments. So I'm sure you guys know that in group projects, some people can dominate them. And so you might end up with a presentation that's like 80-20, in which case I take a note of that, because that's kind of strange. And well, then why did that happen? Is sort of a follow-up question I can think about later, not in the moment that I'm grading. So rubrics are really helpful because you have a defined set of criteria for how you come up with a grade. Because when a parent comes and asks you why you mark their students so low, you need to be able to say, you need to be able to show proof of how you came up to your decision. And if you have a criteria checklist that you use the same for every student, then at least your assessment is fair. Okay. And I covered the limitation. Okay. So these are checklists. They are very familiar. They're very easy to use. You generally have characteristics that can be scored very easily. They are, I will tell you from experience, they are very suited for complex behaviors that can be clearly defined. So if you have, you saw it or you didn't see it, or you almost always never, or no, I think I just did that backwards. You almost always see it, you frequently see it, you never see it, sort of things. Like if you have categories that are like very frequently, or no, I'm just butchering this. Okay, so if you have the categories and they're clearly distinguishable from each other, like you have no compunction about you always see it versus you sometimes see it versus you never saw it. Something that's clear like that works well as a checklist categorization technique. And I want to just tell you that checklists do not have to be all like this. So in this particular example, when you're seeing on the right, there's only 2 columns, sort of like pass, fail, yes, no, agree, disagree. It don't have to be like this. They can be more complex. And there can be multiple different levels, in which case you just format your checklist differently. It doesn't have to be exactly like this, but I would always leave yourself a comments field if you do plan to use a checklist, because it'll save you trying to fit it in comments as needed. And what's a better practice, which is not shown in this particular assessment, is to break it up by sequential the sequential tasks that the assessment requires. So if there was setup of something, if there was during and then after in the question phase, you would want to separate those out and potentially give yourself comment fields for each main section of the performance. All right, so rating scales, you are looking at things that are not yes, no. You generally have numbers associated with the categories. The advantage to this, of course, is that you narrow down and you hit on more of a specific you hit on a more of a specific rating of the skill level, I think is a good way to think of it. So, you got an 8 out of 10. Well, you were pretty good, but you didn't hit everything. So that's the sort of idea here. And you do hit on the most important parts of the task, but your attention is generally sometimes you just get stuck on things that are missing, like you're waiting for something to show up and you missed some aspect of the performance while you're waiting for this other section of the scale to appear. And so rating scales are nice, but they are only suited for very specific performances. Checklists are a lot easier to use than rating scales because what is a 1 versus what is an 8 versus what is 10 is sometimes really hard to define until you've seen more of the performances. And then if you've seen more of the performances and you start changing your numbers, then that's not exactly fair. That means that you're not rating them all equally. So I would just say approach rating scales with a warning. They can be more difficult than you think they are. I'll just say that. So here's an example of a rating scale. This is going to be something that you would see this one's particularly for dancing. So if you're familiar with rubrics, this is sort of hitting on the rubric rating scale idea, where you have a certain number of points, and then you have it extremely well documented what exactly counts as the body and time and space and relationship. So for this one, when we take a look at time, for example, at 2 points, you have no rhythm or music. At 3 points, you have a rhythm, either uneven or even, and no music. 4, you have rhythm, either uneven or even, or tempo, but it doesn't match the music. So you can tell distinctly what this is. And when you're going about rating it, you might just, put an X or something over the square that most fits into the student's performance. The more specific you can make these, the better. And I would say that you are not stuck in a grid like this. So if you have other sections that don't span the whole points totals, like you've only, okay, so for these, they're each worth 5 points total. Well, if something's only worth 4 points, you're allowed to do that. That just means that the 5-point category is blank in a rubric like this, because the 5 points doesn't exist. 4 points would be the highest point that you could hit. Just, keep your mind aware of the fact that there are other potential ways to go about creating these. Okay, holistic scoring is scary. Holistic scoring to me is where you sort of you give students a grade based on the whole thing, and it's a global thing, and it's generally a letter grade. And there's nothing really defining what went into the letter grade. So it's a little, it's like taking a look at a huge comprehensive project and saying, that looks like an A. So you can probably tell I'm biased. I do not like holistic scoring. It is not that great to me. But I am, of course, biased in this. You're looking at overall value, and you are either giving it a numeric or a letter grade, and that's it. It's not a fan, but there are ways to do it effectively. I've seen some teachers do it effectively and fairly, but it is very easy to go awry. So I would caution you from using holistic scoring. And if you are going to use it, I would say that the most important part of this is to know exactly what perfect is, to go into the whole project and stick to it, knowing what perfect is, to use that as a reference, and that'll help make it more fair. Okay, so this is holistic scoring, where you say for this entire thing, all components of the task, you have the food cooked well, presentation was good, you were comfortable throughout the meal. Like, these are really different things that you're scoring on, but you give the whole bed and breakfast thing a 4 for everything. And I think that's a good idea and a good example to think about is hotel ratings. You don't just rate the hotel generally on the beds or the concierge or the check-in and out process. Generally, you just give them one blanket score, and that is a pretty good expression of holistic scoring. One score for a whole big project. But yeah, that is how that works. All right, when you create rubrics, you really want to get a variety of accomplishments on that rubric, but you have to choose wisely, right? You can't measure everything, especially if it's something that's happening really quickly. If it's a dancer's movements, then that's happening in a blink of an eye, and you better be able to measure it quickly. So you need to pick a scoring plan that best suits the assessment that you're measuring, and try to limit the number of points, which seems a little strange, but the more points you add to the scale, the more categories you have, and the more categories you have, the harder it is to tell the difference between the categories, is really what this boils down to. So 5 is generally pretty wieldy. What I would caution you against doing, which I didn't think to remember to write earlier, is that do not straddle points. In which case, I'm sorry, I'm not sure that makes sense to anyone but myself. But what that means is don't make a column worth 10 to 8 points, and the next column be worth 7 to 5 points. Right? Each one is worth its own point value. So you have something that's worth 10 points or 9 points or 8 points. You have each column one for 10, one for 9, one for 8. You don't have one that's 8 through 10, because then you can't tell. It's not very easy to tell in a single column, well, what is the 8 versus what is the 10? I don't see any clear criteria for distinguishing 8 versus 10, and that's really the point of this, is distinguishing between point values so that students know exactly what it is that they did wrong and why they got the grade that they did. All right, so specifying testing constraints, you have to keep in mind these sort of common things. The amount of time involved in this task. Do they take it home with them? Is it only in class? How much time do you need to devote to this, both your own teaching time and their time? The reference materials they might need, do they get to use other people? Do they need special equipment? How much prior knowledge do they need going into this task? And then the scoring criteria. So these are the things you need to really think about when you're going into this, and to remember that these are supposed to be authentic assessments, and ideally they should have sort of a fun element to them, because it's kind of unusual for students to get to participate in authentic assessments, and they generally really enjoy them. So do try to not, make it so dull and dry, right? So hopefully not like this lecture. Okay. I forgot I had all these transitions on here. Okay. Step 4. You need to think about the constraints. If you remember, again, we're going back. This is all about authentically replicating things. So what kind of constraints exist in the real world? Well, in the real world, you generally are able to pull out a calculator if you really need it, or you generally have the coins potentially rolled up in coin holders. I don't know, coin sleeves maybe, or they're already separated out in the trays or something like that. That is something that generally occurs. People are generally standing if they're doing the grocery store simulation. These are constraints that are normal. If someone is giving a dance recital, then they should keep in mind the constraint of the stage, right? There's only so much room. So if you're assessing them in a studio versus assessing them on the stage, you need to remember that there's only a certain amount of space on the stage itself. Okay. And you should be thinking about these sort of limits on the availability of resources. So if there's, in general, only 4 of something, then don't let students have more than 4 of them. That is about all I can think of insofar as limits go. So limits on time are especially important in classrooms, so that you have enough time to go through all these assessments, because they can take quite a fair bit of the class time to do. So you will know as you do this, you start putting together an authentic assessment, what the sort of constraints and limits are, and you will get some guidance back from us about that as you do your performance-based assessment project, where you actually create a whole sort of lesson plan, if you will, using performance-based assessment.